Good Shabbos. Everyone's so far back. I'll come all the way back here. Whenever I put my kippah on in the morning, my yarmulke on in the morning, it's very powerful to me. And it's really very powerful for two reasons. The first reason that it's so powerful whenever I put my kippah, my yarmulke on in the morning, it's because I have to make a decision what yarmulke matches with what outfit, and Rebecca doesn't help me. It's much more of a challenge than you realize. The second reason it's so powerful is because whenever I put my kippah, my yarmulke on, I know that for the rest of the day when I'm wearing that kippah, I'm a representative of the Jewish people. Wherever I go, whatever I do, they know that I'm Jewish. And I get racial profiled in that way, right? Whatever those people that I encounter over the course of the day feel about Jews, that's what they bring to their encounter with me because I'm wearing my Judaism, well, not on my sleeve, but on my head. And so it makes me even more mindful of how I behave. When I go to the grocery store, I make sure everything is please and thank you. Wherever I am, I try to let others maybe go first ahead of me. I try to be as polite as I can possibly be. Because I know that wherever I go with this kippah on my head, I'm a representative of the Jewish people. And those other people, their interaction with me is going to inform how they view all Jews everywhere. I'm very mindful of this, which means sometimes I don't want to wear my kippah. Sometimes it's nice to be a little bit anonymous. Sometimes it's nice to not have to represent the entire Jewish people. If I'm going to a baseball game, if I'm going to Comerica Park, sometimes it's nice to just put on my baseball hat and I can yell at the other team with impunity and not fear that I'm disgracing the entire Jewish people because I want to root against Cleveland. I know sometimes when I'm going to the grocery store and I just want to wear shorts and a t-shirt and sandals and it might not all match, that if I just put my baseball cap on, I can go in, I can run right through the line. I still say please and thank you, but maybe not as effusively as I might otherwise. And I can go about my day and it doesn't affect the future of the Jewish people. And I know, and I'm going to out myself to you right now, I like to go to the casino. Once or twice a year, I like to go to the casino. There's nothing halachically wrong with it, I promise you. And I'll assure you that I always go to Minyan the morning I go to the casino. And I usually have a pretty good day. Thanks God. But when I go to the casino, do I go in there with my suit and tie on and my kippah? No. I put my baseball hat on. And no one knows that that morning I prayed my heart out, so I have a few extra dollars to give to tzedakah at the end of the day. As Jews, we have a choice of when to wear who we are on our sleeves, or on our head as the case may be, and when to go anonymous. When we don't have to represent the entire Jewish people to the non-Jewish world. The African American community does not have that same choice. Wherever they go, whatever they do, they are racial profiled. Wherever they go and whatever they do, they wear people's perspectives right in front of them. They can see it. They can't hide. They are who they are. Sometimes that's for good. Sometimes it doesn't make a difference. And we know far too often that they suffer prejudice, that they suffer racism because they can't hide who they are. And so over the last couple weeks we've been watching. And we know about the attack that took place in the church a week or so ago by the mentally ill man who walked into an African American church, opened fire after studying with these people, Bible study for an hour. He then opened fire, I think killing 9 people and injuring others because they were African American. And as a result of that killing, what is the very next thing we hear? We hear that the Confederate flag is going to come down from the state flag. We hear that the Confederate flag is going to be removed from so many different places, and this has become the debate about the role of the Confederate flag. I am certain that this man would have done what he had done, whether or not the Confederate flag was in the midst of the state flag or not. Nevertheless, the Confederate flag is a clear symbol of hate. And so even though the tie between the two, between the shooting and the placement of the Confederate flag is somewhat tenuous, it deserves to come down. The Confederate flag should be removed everywhere. Because after all, how would we feel as Jews if we walked into a state capitol and there on the state flag was a small swastika in the corner, just for memory's sake? We, of course, would be up in arms. And so as Jews, I believe we have to support our African American brothers and sisters. We have to support all those who are calling for the Confederate flag to come down, even if it's not a direct connection between the shooting that took place in Charleston and the placement of the Confederate flag. Symbols of hate for any people do not belong in our great country. They don't belong anywhere. So I was mindful of that this week when I was, of course, reading the newspaper, and we heard about the tragedy that happened in Detroit. There was a criminal who took off in his car. The police got in their car and started on a police chase. And tragically, they drove into a group of children, killing some of the kids. It was a terrible tragedy. And I read the next paper in the Free Press that in our own backyard, our own community, Detroit was angry at the police officers for participating in that high-speed pursuit. And my thought was, aren't we blaming the wrong people here? Shouldn't we be angry at the criminal who took off in the car, not the police who are trying to protect us, who chased after him? And I was wrestling with that when I came to our Torah portion this week, Parashat Chukat. And as I mentioned in Chukat, Miriam dies, Aaron dies. But we see before Aaron dies an encounter between the people and Moses and Aaron. Now, in order to fully understand our Torah portion this week, we actually have to go back into the book of Exodus. In the book of Exodus, chapter 17, which took place in the very beginning of our people's journey, even before they received the Torah on Sinai. We know the people complained that they were thirsty, that they didn't have water to drink, and they said to Moshe Rabbeinu, they said to Moses, "Why did you take us out of Egypt, where we had it pretty good, in order to bring us out here to the wilderness so we don't have any water and we're going to die of dehydration?" So Moses appeals to God, and Moses says to God, "God, I look terrible here. I brought the people out of Egypt, and here I'm going to let them die without water?" So God says to Moses in the book of Exodus, "Okay, Moses, I'm going to make you look good. You strike the rock, and water will pour forth, and the people and their animals will drink." And sure enough, that's what happened. Moses was a hero. He struck the rock, water came forth, and everybody had what they needed. Fast forward now about 39 years to our Torah portion today. And here we are in Parashat Chukat, and we're nearing the end of our ancestors' journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. They've been wandering for 40 years. And sure enough, the same situation happens. Miriam dies. And we know that Miriam was the source of water for the Jewish people. She was endowed with the miraculous ability to find water wherever they were. And so she dies, and the people are worried that they're going to be without water. And again, now they complain to Moses and Aaron. They say, "You took us out of Egypt where we had it so good. We had figs, and we had pomegranates, and we had all this wonderful food, and we had all of the water we needed. And you brought us out here to die in the wilderness of thirst." So once again, Moses appeals to God, and Moses says to God, "God, I look terrible here." The people are complaining once again. They're complaining how good they had it in Egypt when they were slaves. And those ingrateful people, Miriam dies, and the next thing they're complaining already again that they don't have any water. Moses says to God, "God, I need to give the people water." So God says to Moses this time, "Okay, Moses, you speak to the rock, and water will pour forth." Now we know that in Exodus, God told Moses to do what to the rock? Strike it. And in the book of Numbers here, chapter 20, in Numbers 20, God says to Moses to do what to the rock? Speak to it. Well, Moses, in his anger and in his frustration with the Israelite people who were constantly complaining, constantly demonstrating their lack of faith in God, who had brought them from slavery into freedom, who had fed them for 40 years that they never starved, who had brought and provided them water throughout all this time, who had allowed them to grow into this great and massive number of people. Moses is so angry that he strikes the rock not once, but twice. Now again, in Exodus, God told Moses to do what to the rock? Strike it. But in Numbers, God told Moses to do what? Speak to it. Moses didn't speak to it. He struck the rock not once, but twice. And he yelled at the Israelites, "You rebels, you want water? I'm going to provide for you water." And that's when he struck the rock not once, but twice. Now sure enough, water poured forth, and there was enough water for the Israelites to drink and to feed and give water to their animals. But thereafter, God said to Moses, "Moses, because you did not have faith in me, because you did not believe in me, you, Moses, will not be able to enter the promised land. Leadership will be taken away from you and given to Joshua." Because Moses struck the rock instead of speaking to it, leadership was taken away from Moses and ultimately given to Joshua to finish the journey into the promised land. And as I was studying this portion, I asked the question, who's really at fault? Wasn't it the Israelites who were yet again complaining against Moses and against God that they didn't have what they needed? Shouldn't we be blaming the Israelites? Okay, so Moses didn't speak to it, he struck the rock, fine, whoop-de-doo. It's the people, again, their lack of faith. But that's not who God punished. God punished Moses. God expected more out of Moses. Moses was the one who was punished. And so as I brought it back to our own situation here in Detroit, I asked the question, is it right for Detroit to be angry at the police officers? And in some ways I said yes, because we expect more out of the police officers, because they have policies and procedures in place to keep our people safe. And all the more so, we as Jews have to understand when an African American community is going to be angry against the police system, that's going to be angry against a society and a country that has subjugated them for centuries. We're not so far out of slavery for the African American community. We're certainly not so far away from segregation, away from persecution. And we are still in the midst of racism. It's time that we start making a hard look at our society right now and saying maybe the way the institutions exist, that time was fine for a certain period, just like it was fine for Moses to be leader for a certain period. And we now need to ask the question, what needs to change? Maybe it's time for Joshua to come in and take over leadership. We might be a century and a half away from slavery. We might be decades away from institutional segregation. But we're still in the midst of racism. And as Jews, we understand what that means. As Jews, we have an obligation to stand up for all of those who are in need, all of those who are oppressed and persecuted. So with your permission, I would like to call on our Social Action Committee, whose chair happens to be here. Hi, Adam. I want to call on our Social Action Committee. I want to call on our interfaith outreach people to begin to lead this congregation to ask the question, what can we do to work to end racism? What can we do to build bridges between the Jewish community and the African American community? What can we do to strengthen the bonds between our great synagogue and the churches in our area? Because we live in a world where racism is still present. And it is a Jew's obligation to end oppression, to end suffering, wherever we see it. This Shabbat of Parshat Chukat, where we recognize to everything there is a season, And there is a time for certain generations to end what they do and new generations to come up. Let us work in our own day to end the days of racism and to truly begin a day and an era when all people, when all of God's children can feel the blessings of freedom that we Jews feel, whether we're wearing our kippahs or our baseball hats. Shabbat Shalom.